Where can you find 6,000 local businesses with just one click? EverythingMidmo.com.
Hello and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes webcast. Today we'll talk about the Nebraska game. Dave, 27-12 loss. Missouri's leading 12-0 going in the fourth quarter. Then it really all falls apart in a hurry with a big pass play and then two straight interceptions by Blaine Gabbert. What did you see as maybe the factors contributing to the offense's problems in that game? There's obviously bad weather, good defense, etc. What did you see as some of the keys?
I think the bad weather affected both teams, so I don't know how much you can make that out to be a big factor in this game at least. Or I don't know if you will really make sweeping conclusions about Missouri's offense based on that game, except for the fact that the offensive line had some breakdowns again and really had trouble blocking Nebraska's inside guys, and Ndamukong Suh, who everyone has trouble blocking, but Jared Crick, the guy next to him, also had some trouble. And those guys were just so disruptive against Missouri's line that just caused a lot of problems, both against the pass and against the run. We saw Missouri struggle again to run the ball successfully. They had a couple decent runs, but more than a few of those were called back on holding penalties. Those holds are committed by younger players in there, and that was really detrimental to Missouri's game. I think they ended up with 4 offensive holding by offensive linemen this game. Missouri had 10 all of last year. So I think that's a red flag in this case, and it's something to be concerned about if it becomes kind of a common thread with this team. Are they going to keep pushing themselves back in unmanageable situations where the running game almost becomes obsolete when you're constantly in 1st and 20 and 2nd and 25, and that's what they faced in that game, and that's tough to manage. Eventually that's going to catch up with you as it did that night.
Yeah, and it wouldn't necessarily be that big of a concern if it was just the Nebraska game where they had trouble running the ball or moving out the opposing defensive line, because Nebraska is probably one of the better defensive lines they're going to face. They also had trouble against Nevada, which is sort of an unheralded defensive line. They haven't been great all year as far as blocking for the run. So that would be, I think, Missouri's biggest concern going forward is if you are going to be a one-dimensional team, you could have some troubles because in the Big 12, you're going to, everybody's going to be competent defensively at least. Sure. Not great. It's not a great defensive league, but they're going to be competent. And if you're just basically dropping back to pass 40 times a game, it's going to be hard to see Missouri doing much better than breaking even.
Right.
Some people were a little concerned about the play calling based on the weather, thinking that Missouri passed the ball too much in those conditions. In hindsight, after they give up the big score, they probably would have been better off just running the ball 3 times and punting. The punt was their best play on this game, but at the time, I guess it didn't strike me as being terrible play calling. What did you think about it?
Well, if you look back at what they did on every down and distance in that game, considering the situation, they tried to run the ball. Derek Washington had 20 carries. That's the second most of his career, 2-year starter. And, they just got in so many situations where it was 1st and 20 or 2nd and 20, plays that in hindsight, when David Yost was asked about this on Monday, he said maybe we should have tried to run the ball, maybe try to get 4 or 5 yards a carry instead of 0 on an incomplete pass. But they weren't averaging 4 or 5 yards a carry in that game. They averaged about 2.5. That's not going to cut it when you need 20 yards for the first down. So you kind of set yourself up to be one-dimensional because you can't run the ball effectively. And when you've got a gimpy quarterback back there, it's just a recipe for disaster, and that's ended up what it was. Now, they had a chance. They were close throughout that game until the fourth quarter, and I think Nebraska proved in the fourth quarter that you can throw the ball in those conditions. Granted, they were on a short field for 2 of those drives, but they showed a less explosive offense, at least passing-wise, was able to throw the ball. So I don't know if that's a really good excuse for Missouri. I think the conditions weren't ideal, but I think trying to throw the ball in that situation, as long as you get protection, is doable. And it just ended up not being because of the down and distance situations that they put themselves in.
Now, we were sitting in the dry comfort of the press box, but I do believe at that point in the fourth quarter, too, the rain had let up a little bit when Nebraska threw that long bomb. I think that it almost stopped. It hadn't completely stopped, but fourth quarter it was maybe a little lighter than it had been in the other parts of the game. I guess maybe the plays I would disagree with, and there's only a couple. I think they ran some option with him, which I didn't see the point because he could barely move. And
right.
It was basically like Nebraska just inviting him to keep it so they could take another shot at him. So I didn't really see the point in that. But the pass-run mix, I mean, when you run the ball as badly as Missouri runs it, I don't know that there's a whole lot of point in continuing to run it, except for the fact that the punt was their best play in that game. So in hindsight, sure, but at the time I didn't think it was egregious in any way. Some people after that game, the way Sue dominated it, he's an interesting case because not only does he do the defensive tackle things, kind of plug the gaps and occupy his man, he makes a ton of plays. He leads them in tackles, and you saw it all against Missouri. Does he enter the Heisman conversation at this point? We were both Heisman voters, and right. I will share a little scene from after the game where Dave walked out of the press box and said, who's going to be the first reactionary to say that Sue deserves the Heisman? And then I'm reading his blog one day later, and Dave suggests he deserves the Heisman. But how do you feel he might fit in? Is it possible?
I assume there'd be a lot of kind of knee-jerk commentary that people would say, oh, put him in the Heisman mix. And I thought about the next day, and you look around, the front runners, the people we at least thought would be front runners for this award, are either banged up or just not playing as well. Colt McCoy especially, and Tebow and Bradford obviously have been hurt. Why not throw his name in there? I mean, he is obviously the best, most productive defensive lineman in the country, maybe the most productive defensive player. He's one of the Big 12 leaders in pass deflections, and that's crazy for a 300-pound guy in the front of the line there. Had the interception the other night, should have had 2, had a sack, could have had 3. He's just that disruptive, and he really, it almost doesn't matter who's lined up behind him when you get that kind of play from a guy up front. So, yeah, I think he should be in the mix at this point. And I think the good thing about the media these days, and there's so much talk about the Heisman, even in September, is we're constantly tracking the people who could be in the mix. So I think we have a better feel for who should deserve the award. And you see a lot of names out there right now that might not register with average fans, but I think should be in the mix because they're playing really well. Mark Ingram, the running back at Alabama, I think is in the mix. Ryan Williams, running back, at Virginia Tech, came in for their injured starter and has done really well. So you're seeing Sue's name along with some of those. Tony Pike, the quarterback at Cincinnati. So I like the fact that we talk Heisman so much because you would hope in the end somebody deserving is going to get there. It could be Tim Tebow. He could bounce back, or Colt McCoy. He's got a big chance this weekend. But I think at this point, Sue should definitely be in the mix there with the top 5, top 10 guys.
Yeah, when you vote, you get a number 1 slot, a 2 slot, and a 3 slot. And I voted for defensive guys lots of times before, and I think it's fine. You might want to hold them to the same standard as you hold quarterbacks, though. I mean, would you vote for Sue if Nebraska goes 9-3? Maybe not. I mean, it's become kind of an award, not just a quarterback award, but also an award for teams contending for the national title. That's another. It's one of those awards that there's not a real defined criteria. It's kind of up to however many voters there are. There's a ton of them. But I guess if you're going to want to vote for a defensive guy, to me, you hold him to the same standard.
Exactly.
And he needs to do what he can to get Nebraska to be, say, the Big 12 North champions. At that point, I think he is a viable candidate. Lastly, how does Missouri's Big 12 North chances look now? I mean, is it all over? They've lost a home game within the division. That tends to be a bit of a kiss of death. How realistic is it now that they could bounce back and win the North?
Mathematically, obviously, they're still alive, but I think they have to win one of these next 2 games, either at Oklahoma State or back home against Texas. If you lose both of those and you start out 0-3, your best case scenario is 5-3 in the conference. That means Nebraska has to go 4-4 for you to be able to beat them out because of the head-to-head matchup.
Unless you have a 3-way tie.
Unless you have a 3-way tie with Kansas, and they're obviously going to be in the mix too. But if you're just talking about beating out Nebraska, that's going to be tough to do because I don't know if we see them have 4 games on the schedule that they could lose. Now, they could be 6-2 or 5-3, but Missouri put itself in a hole with that loss the other night. Now, that doesn't mean that the season is over by any means, and even if they lose these next 2 games, Missouri, they've got 4 very winnable games after that: Colorado, Baylor, Iowa State, and Kansas State. They could still be going into that Kansas game with the chance to go 9-3, which I think would exceed most people's preseason expectations. But winning the North got a lot tougher after Thursday night.
Yeah, I could see them having a chance if it becomes a 3-way tie with 3 teams that are 5-3. And I did say that Nebraska obviously is the front runner at this point, but they have to go to Kansas, and so Kansas wins that one, then they all end up with the 3-way tie. Then and Missouri beats Kansas, they would have to do that. Then you could have boil down to who has the highest BCS rating basically at the end. The thing about Nebraska is they were impressive in that 4th quarter. Through the first 3 quarters, I think you saw their Achilles heel is that they don't have a lot of offensive playmakers. They really have to do a lot of things right to score. Yeah. And if they get into a few of these Big 12 style matches beginning this weekend against Texas Tech, I mean, they might have a little trouble keeping up. with a team like that.
Sure.
Well, tomorrow, if you tune into the webcast, we will speak a little bit more about Missouri's visit to Oklahoma State.